World War II was the deadliest and most widespread conflict in human history. It redrew borders, reshaped empires, and redefined what humanity was capable of, both in terms of cruelty and courage. More than just a clash of armies, it was a global upheaval that touched every continent, every ocean, and every kind of life. Over 70 million people died, nations rose and fell, and the consequences of those 6 years are still unfolding today. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through the entire story of World War II, from the seeds of conflict planted after World War I to the last bombs dropped over Japan. The video is divided into 7 main parts, each one exploring a key phase of the war in detail. We'll start with the roots of the conflict and trace the timeline all the way to the aftermath and the legacy the war left behind. After the main 7 parts, we've also included a bonus section where we dive into overlooked and fascinating topics like the Holocaust, wartime propaganda, and women in the war. Whether you're brand new to the subject or you've studied it before, this video is designed to be an immersive, thoughtful, and complete look at the war that defined the 20th century. Let's begin. Part 1. The Roots of Conflict, Treaty of Versailles and its Consequences. After World War I ended in 1918, the world was desperate for peace. Nations had witnessed destruction on a scale never seen before. Trenches that stretched across continents, chemical warfare, millions dead, and economies in ruin. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was supposed to be the document that would ensure that such a catastrophe could never happen again. But instead of healing the wounds of war, it would sow the seeds for an even greater conflict just 2 decades later. The treaty was primarily driven by the Allied powers, especially France, Britain, and the United States. Each came to the negotiating table with different goals. France, having suffered immensely on its own soil, wanted security and revenge. Britain wanted to preserve its empire and maintain a balance of power. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, wanted a more idealistic peace centered around his 14 points and the idea of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But in the end, compromise gave way to punishment, and Germany was made the scapegoat. One of the most controversial aspects of the treaty was the War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which placed sole responsibility for the war in Germany and its allies. This wasn't just symbolic. It became the legal basis for demanding that Germany pay massive reparations to the Allied countries. The figure was later set at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical amount for a nation already economically shattered by war. These reparations destabilized Germany's economy, leading to massive inflation, unemployment, and widespread poverty. By the early 1920s, German currency had lost so much value that people were literally carrying wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. All savings were wiped out overnight. In addition to the economic burden, the treaty also imposed severe territorial losses. Germany lost about 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control. The Polish quarter split Germany in two, creating a path to the sea for the new state of Poland, but severing East Prussia from the rest of the country. Overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific were taken and distributed among the Allies under the guise of League of Nations mandates. Militarily, the treaty was humiliating. Germany was forbidden from having an air force, submarines, or tanks. Its army was reduced to just 100,000 troops, barely enough to maintain internal order, let alone defend its borders. The Navy was limited, and the production of weapons and war materials was tightly restricted. The Rhineland, a critical region bordering France and Belgium, had to be completely demilitarized. German troops were not even allowed to step foot in it. All of this left the German people feeling humiliated, betrayed, and furious. They didn't believe they had lost the war in the field. Many clung to the myth that Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies like socialists and Jews. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles became a rallying cry for nationalists, extremists, and right-wing populists. Political instability plagued the Weimar Republic, Germany's fledgling democracy, which was seen as weak and illegitimate for signing the treaty. In this environment of anger and despair, Adolf Hitler rose to prominence. He called the Treaty of Versailles a national disgrace and vowed to reverse its terms, rebuild Germany's military, and restore its pride. Millions of Germans, desperate for hope and stability, listened. Hitler's promises to defy the treaty's restrictions and reclaim Germany's former glory helped propel him to power. Ironically, the treaty that was meant to secure a lasting peace did the opposite. Instead of healing, it inflicted a deep psychological wound on Germany. Instead of stabilizing Europe, it created resentment, division, and extremism. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just fail to prevent World War II, it practically wrote its opening chapters. The rise of fascism and Nazism. After World War I, much of Europe was left in ruins, physically, economically, and psychologically. The Treaty of Versailles had placed the full blame for the war on Germany, burdening it with immense reparations and territorial losses. In the wake of national humiliation, economic collapse, and political instability, the stage was set for radical ideologies to take root. Fascism and Nazism were born from this chaos, each offering simple answers to complex problems, wrapped in promises of national renewal and greatness. In Italy, Benito Mussolini rose to power in 1922, presenting fascism as a third way between capitalism and socialism. He emphasized ultranationalism, the glorification of the state, and the necessity of a strong authoritarian leader. Italy became a one-party dictatorship. Mussolini's regime crushed opposition, controlled the media, and aggressively pursued militarization and empire building, most notably in Africa. Meanwhile, in Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party, gained traction throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. Hitler capitalized on Germany's sense of betrayal after World War I, widespread unemployment, and fear of communism. By 1933, Hitler had become chancellor and swiftly dismantled democratic institutions. The Nazi regime promoted an extreme form of nationalism, racial purity, and anti-Semitism, framing Jews, communists, and other minority groups as enemies of the state. One of the core tenets of both ideologies was the rejection of liberal democracy and the embrace of authoritarian control. Both Mussolini and Hitler created tightly controlled societies with powerful secret police forces, state propaganda machines, and indoctrination of youth. Dissent was crushed, and any challenge to the state was met with imprisonment, exile, or death. The consequences were profound and far-reaching. Fascism and Nazism destabilized the European order, leading to a wave of aggressive expansion. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, testing the weakness of the League of Nations. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and then dismantled Czechoslovakia, all without significant resistance from other European powers. These actions emboldened Hitler and Mussolini, reinforcing the idea that military aggression would go unchecked. Perhaps most tragically, the ideologies they unleashed created the conditions for genocide, total war, and the deaths of tens of millions. The rise of fascism and Nazism wasn't just a regional political shift. It was the ignition of one of the darkest chapters in human history: the Great Depression and global instability. After the First World War, much of the world was already teetering on the edge of instability. Then came the Great Depression, a global economic collapse that started in the United States in 1929 and quickly spread around the globe. Banks failed, businesses shut down, unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. Entire families were thrown into poverty, and nations that had barely recovered from the last war were suddenly grappling with mass economic despair. In Germany, the effects were especially devastating. Saddled with enormous reparations from the Treaty of Versailles and reliant on American loans to stabilize their economy, the German financial system collapsed when Wall Street crashed. Millions lost their jobs and inflation skyrocketed. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, began to crumble under the weight of public dissatisfaction and political polarization. The middle class, desperate for stability and hope, became increasingly open to extremist ideologies. This wasn't just a German problem. In Italy, Japan, and other nations, The Depression fed a growing sense of disillusionment with liberal democracy. People were angry, afraid, and willing to look to authoritarian leaders who promised to restore national pride and economic stability. In the United States and Britain, leaders struggled to maintain confidence in democratic institutions. But in many other countries, democracy gave way to dictatorship. As the global economy faltered, international cooperation unraveled. Countries turned inward, embracing protectionist policies and nationalist rhetoric. This breakdown in trust in diplomacy created fertile ground for future conflict. The world was becoming more divided, more paranoid, and more militarized. Economic hardship didn't just reshape economies. It reshaped ideologies, alliances, and ultimately set the stage for the most devastating war in human history. Japanese expansion in Asia. After World War I, Japan emerged as a rising power with growing imperial ambitions. Driven by a desire for natural resources, living space, and national prestige, Japan increasingly turned its attention to mainland Asia. In 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army staged an incident on the South Manchurian Railway as a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria, a region rich in resources. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Japan withdrew from the League and solidified control, renaming the territory Manchukuo and installing a puppet regime under the former Chinese Emperor Puyi. The international community's weak response emboldened Japan, which soon set its sights on China itself. In 1937, full-scale war broke out following the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. This marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces rapidly captured major Chinese cities, including Shanghai and Nanjing. The occupation of Nanjing led to one of the war's worst atrocities, the Nanjing Massacre, in which hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were brutally killed and widespread sexual violence occurred. Despite Japan's early victories, Chinese resistance persisted, led by both the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. Japan's war in China turned into a brutal, grinding conflict. In order to support its military campaigns, Japan increasingly relied on conquest to secure access to oil, rubber, and other critical resources. This expansion led to further incursions into Southeast Asia. By the early 1940s, Japan had occupied French Indochina with the consent of the Vichy regime, escalating tensions with Western powers. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed economic sanctions, including an oil embargo that threatened Japan's ability to sustain its war machine. Facing resource starvation and strategic isolation, Japan opted for a bold and aggressive expansion strategy to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This expansionist ambition ultimately led Japan to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, aiming to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure a free hand in Asia. The attack brought the United States into the war and transformed a regional conflict into a truly global one. Japan's rapid expansion across the Pacific and Asia in the early months of 1942 would soon face fierce resistance and reversal. But in those years leading up to the broader conflict, Japanese imperialism had already set much of the stage for World War II in the East, Italy's imperial ambitions. After World War I, Italy found itself on the winning side, but with very little to show for it. The Treaty of Versailles had not granted the territorial rewards many Italians had expected, fueling a sense of betrayal and the rise of nationalism. Benito Mussolini, who came to power in 1922, tapped into that national frustration. His dream was to resurrect a modern Roman Empire, expanding Italy's influence across the Mediterranean and Africa. One of the earliest and most infamous examples of Mussolini's imperial ambitions was the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations at the time, had previously humiliated Italy in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. Mussolini saw a second war against Ethiopia not only as a way to erase that historical stain, but also as a path to colonial glory. Italian forces, equipped with modern weapons and even chemical gas, launched a brutal campaign against the outgunned Ethiopians. Despite international condemnation and sanctions from the League of Nations, the invasion was a success. By 1936, Italy had officially annexed Ethiopia, combining it with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland to create Italian East Africa. This conquest boosted Mussolini's image at home, but exposed the weakness of international institutions meant to preserve peace. It also drew Italy closer to Germany, as both nations faced increasing isolation from the global community. In the years that followed, Mussolini continued to meddle in the affairs of the Balkans and North Africa, seeing these regions as natural zones of Italian dominance. Though Italy's imperial ambitions were bold on paper, in practice they were often poorly executed and stretched the nation's military resources thin. This overreach would come back to haunt Italy when the broader conflict of World War II erupted. The Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, which raged from 1936 to 1939, was more than just a brutal conflict within Spain. It became a testing ground for the ideologies, weapons, and tactics that would soon explode across the globe in World War II. On one side were the Republicans, a coalition of left-wing groups including communists, socialists, and anarchists. On the other side stood the Nationalists, a far-right alliance led by General Francisco Franco, backed by monarchists, fascists, and conservative forces. But the conflict quickly spilled beyond Spain's borders as foreign powers intervened, not with full-scale armies, but with weapons, advisors, and air support. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sided with Franco's nationalists. Hitler saw an opportunity to test out his new Luftwaffe, particularly the dive-bombing Stuka planes. Mussolini hoped to expand Italy's influence. One of the most infamous outcomes of their involvement was the bombing of Guernica by the German Condor Legion in 1937, a devastating attack on civilians that shocked the world and inspired Picasso's haunting painting. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supported the Republicans with weapons, tanks, and military advisors, using the war as a proxy battle against fascism and a stage to assert influence. Tactics that would later define World War II, Blitzkrieg-style air and ground coordination, armored vehicle assaults, and urban warfare were all experimented with in the Spanish landscape. It also marked one of the first times modern aerial bombing was used systematically against civilian populations, previewing the horrors to come. While the Western democracies largely stayed out of the war officially, thousands of international volunteers from around the world, especially the United States, Britain, and France, joined the Republican cause in what became known as the International Brigades. These volunteers saw the fight in Spain as the front line of the battle against fascism. In 1939, Franco's nationalists claimed victory. Spain fell under a long-lasting dictatorship, and the conflict ended just months before Hitler invaded Poland. For many, the Spanish Civil War was not just a civil conflict. It was a dress rehearsal for the devastation of the Second World War. Part 2. The Road to War. Japan's invasion of China. In 1937, tensions between Japan and China erupted into full-scale war, with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a seemingly minor skirmish near Beijing that spiraled into a massive conflict. Japan had already seized Manchuria in 1931 and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. But now its ambitions expanded. The Japanese Imperial Army launched a brutal invasion of mainland China, swiftly capturing key cities including Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. The invasion was marked by extreme violence and atrocities. In what became known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, Japanese forces slaughtered hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war. Rape, looting, and widespread destruction shocked the world, though international response was limited. Journalists and missionaries who remained in the city documented the horrors, creating one of the earliest major international scandals of World War II. Despite Japan's military superiority and early successes, Chinese resistance was fierce. The Chinese nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, refused to surrender. They relocated the capital to Chongqing and continued to fight with limited support. The Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong also resisted the Japanese, though often independently from the nationalists. This dual resistance would later influence the future of China after the war. Japan hoped for a quick victory, but found itself bogged down in a grinding war of attrition. Vast distances, tough terrain, and determined Chinese resistance turned the campaign into a quagmire. Cities changed hands, supply lines were stretched, and the front lines often blurred with guerrilla warfare. The Second Sino-Japanese War soon became deeply entwined with the broader conflict of World War II. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the United States entered the war, China was recognized as one of the major Allied powers. The war in China drained Japanese resources and tied down hundreds of thousands of troops, contributing significantly to Japan's eventual defeat. But the cost was staggering. Millions of Chinese civilians died. Cities were reduced to rubble. And the scars of the invasion would shape Sino-Japanese relations for decades to come. Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland. In 1936, Adolf Hitler made a bold move that would test the resolve of Europe and signal the beginning of a new aggressive phase of German foreign policy. Defying the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact, he ordered German troops to enter the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone along Germany's western border with France. The region had been stripped of military presence after World War I as a buffer to protect France from another German invasion. The operation was a gamble. The German army was still relatively weak and under-equipped at the time. Hitler later admitted that if the French army had marched into the Rhineland to oppose them, the German troops would have had no choice but to retreat. But France did not act. Neither did Britain. Both countries were weary from the First World War and hesitant to start another conflict. Instead, they chose a path of appeasement, hoping to maintain peace by not confronting Hitler over what many in Britain saw as Germany simply walking into their own backyard. But the remilitarization of the Rhineland was far more than a symbolic gesture. It marked a critical turning point. Not only did it embolden Hitler, convincing him that the Western powers lacked the will to stop his ambitions, but it also allowed Germany to fortify its western border. With the Rhineland rearmed, Hitler could turn his attention eastward without fear of French intervention. It was the first clear test of the post-World War I international order, and the world failed it: the annexation of Austria. In March 1938, Adolf Hitler achieved one of his major goals without firing a single shot: the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, an event known as the Anschluss. For years, Hitler had spoken about uniting all German-speaking peoples under one Reich, and Austria, his own birthplace, was central to that vision. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain had explicitly forbidden the unification of Austria and Germany, fearing the rise of a powerful German state once again. But by the late 1930s, the international community was weary, distracted, and largely unprepared to confront German aggression. Austria at the time was politically unstable and divided. Many Austrians sympathized with the Nazis, especially as Germany's economy and prestige seemed to recover under Hitler's rule. The Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, was under growing pressure from Austrian Nazis and from Berlin. In a desperate attempt to preserve Austria's independence, he called for a national referendum on whether Austria should remain free. But Hitler acted quickly. Before the vote could take place, he threatened invasion. Schuschnigg resigned under pressure, and German troops rolled into Austria on March 12, 1938. They were met not with resistance, but with cheering crowds and Nazi salutes. In many Austrian cities, people welcomed the German soldiers with flowers and banners. Hitler entered Vienna shortly after, declaring the reunion of Austria with Germany. The Anschluss was made official days later with a rigged plebiscite that claimed 99.7% approval. This moment was a clear violation of international agreements. But Britain and France, still hoping to avoid another war, did nothing. The annexation of Austria dramatically expanded the territory, population, and resources of the Third Reich. It also emboldened Hitler, showing him that the Western powers would tolerate aggression without consequence. Austria's fate was sealed, and the road to even greater conflict became clearer. The Munich Agreement and the Sudetenland. In 1938, Adolf Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, particularly the Sudetenland, a region along the border with Germany, home to a large ethnic German population. Hitler claimed that the Sudeten Germans were being mistreated and used this as a pretext to demand that the territory be ceded to Germany. But his motivations ran deeper. The Sudetenland was strategically valuable, heavily fortified, and would leave Czechoslovakia vulnerable if lost. As tensions escalated, Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, entered negotiations with Hitler. In September of that year, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler multiple times in hopes of reaching a peaceful resolution. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed by Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, without any representatives from Czechoslovakia itself. The agreement allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. Chamberlain returned to Britain, proclaiming he had secured peace for our time. But the Munich Agreement quickly became a symbol of the policy of appeasement, conceding to aggressive demands in hopes of avoiding conflict. Just months later, Hitler violated the agreement by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia, revealing that his ambitions extended far beyond the Sudetenland. The Munich Agreement didn't prevent war. It only delayed it, and at the cost of emboldening Nazi Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In late August 1939, just days before the outbreak of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing a non-aggression treaty known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of the two countries, Vyacheslav Molotov of the USSR and Joachim von Ribbentrop of Germany. The agreement publicly pledged that the two nations would not attack each other or support any third party that might do so. But the most critical and sinister part of the deal was hidden from the public. In secret protocols attached to the pact, the two totalitarian regimes divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. They agreed to carve up countries like Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania between themselves. It was a cynical and calculated move by two powers that, despite their opposing ideologies, saw a temporary alliance as politically and strategically advantageous. For Adolf Hitler, the pact ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war when it invaded Poland. For Joseph Stalin, it bought time to build up Soviet defenses and allowed territorial expansion without direct conflict. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, effectively crushing the Polish state in a coordinated move. The world watched in disbelief as two archenemies, fascists and communists, cooperated in one of the most brazen acts of geopolitical manipulation in modern history. The pact remained in effect until June 22, 1941, when Hitler betrayed Stalin by launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. That day, the Nazi-Soviet alliance came to a violent and dramatic end, and the world plunged deeper into the chaos of global war. The invasion of Poland, the official start of World War II. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, German forces launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. Over 1.5 million German troops surged across the border, backed by tanks, artillery, and air support, in what would become known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This sudden, fast-moving, and brutal strategy aimed to overwhelm the Polish defenses before they had a chance to organize a response. Germany had staged a false flag operation the night before, dressing concentration camp prisoners in Polish uniforms, killing them, and using their bodies to fabricate an attack on a German radio station. This staged attack was used as propaganda to justify their invasion, claiming that Poland had acted aggressively. Forces advanced from the west, Poland found itself in a dire position. Despite fierce resistance from Polish troops, they were heavily outmatched in both numbers and technology. The Luftwaffe bombed Polish cities, roads, and military targets, relentlessly disrupting communications and devastating morale. On September 17, just over 2 weeks into the invasion, the Soviet Union entered the fray from the east, under the terms of a secret protocol in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This surprise move crushed any remaining hopes Poland had of holding out. Caught in a pincer movement between two major powers, Poland was partitioned once again. Its independence effectively erased in a matter of weeks. The international response was swift, at least on paper. Britain and France, bound by treaty to protect Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. But aside from a few symbolic actions, no significant military intervention followed. This period of inaction on the Western Front came to be known as the Phony War. The invasion of Poland marked the official start of World War II. It showcased a terrifying new style of warfare and signaled to the world that Hitler was not bluffing. He was willing to go to war to expand his empire. And as Poland fell, the rest of Europe braced for what was coming next. Part 3. Early War. Blitzkrieg and the Fall of France. In the early months of World War II, after Germany invaded Poland, Europe entered a period of eerie calm known as the Phony War. British and French forces stood guard behind the formidable Maginot Line, expecting a long defensive struggle. But Hitler had something entirely different in mind. In the spring of 1940, Germany unleashed a terrifying new style of warfare that would shock the world: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Blitzkrieg was fast, brutal, and coordinated. It combined tanks, motorized infantry, and aircraft in a deadly synchronized assault, meant to break enemy lines and morale before they had a chance to respond. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched this strategy against the Low Countries and France. While Allied forces rushed to defend Belgium, the real German thrust came through the Ardennes-Foresta region, the French considered impassable for tanks. What followed was a military disaster for the Allies. German panzer divisions tore through the Ardennes with astonishing speed, bypassing the main French defenses and slicing deep into the country. By May 15th, French lines were collapsing. Within days, German forces had reached the English Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and large numbers of French troops at Dunkirk. So, the evacuation at Dunkirk, codenamed Operation Dynamo, was a desperate effort to save what remained of the Allied forces. Over 300,000 troops were rescued by a makeshift fleet of naval vessels, merchant ships, and civilian boats. Though hailed as a miracle, the evacuation marked a crushing defeat. Paris fell on June 14th without a prolonged fight. The French government soon requested an armistice. By June 22, 1940, France had surrendered. In just 6 weeks, one of the most powerful armies in Europe had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The speed and effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg stunned the world. Hitler's forces now controlled Western Europe, and Britain stood alone. The fall of France marked a dramatic turning point in the early phase of World War II, a moment when it seemed Nazi Germany might be unstoppable. Battle of Britain. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the skies over Britain became the battleground for one of the most pivotal moments of World War II. After the fall of France, Adolf Hitler turned his attention to Britain, hoping to force a swift surrender through a combination of military pressure and psychological warfare. The key to this plan was gaining air superiority over the Royal Air Force, the RAF. Only then could a full-scale invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, be attempted. The German Luftwaffe began its campaign with strategic attacks on shipping and coastal defenses. But soon the focus shifted to airfields and radar stations in southern England. These installations were crucial to the RAF's ability to detect and respond to incoming attacks. Despite being outnumbered, the RAF used a highly coordinated system of radar detection, ground control, and rapid fighter deployment to counter each wave of German bombers and fighters. By August, the Luftwaffe intensified its assault, launching massive daily raids against RAF infrastructure. Fighter Command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, endured heavy losses but refused to break. British pilots, many barely out of their teens, flew multiple sorties per day, engaging the enemy in fierce dogfights over the English countryside. Their aircraft, the agile Supermarine Spitfire and the sturdy Hawker Hurricane, became symbols of resistance and resilience. In September, frustrated by the RAF's refusal to collapse, Hitler and his commanders shifted tactics. They began bombing British cities, especially London, in what became known as the Blitz. The goal was to terrorize the civilian population and force the British government to negotiate. But the shift away from targeting RAF bases gave Britain much-needed breathing room. The RAF quickly recovered, and their fighter squadrons began inflicting unsustainable losses on the Luftwaffe. By late October, it was clear that Germany had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed, and the Battle of Britain became the first major defeat for Hitler's military machine. It was also the first battle in history fought entirely in the air. The victory kept Britain in the war, preserved a crucial base of operations for future Allied campaigns, and sent a clear message. Nazi Germany could be resisted and beaten. Winston Churchill famously remarked, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The young pilots of the RAF, often referred to as the Few, had defended their island against overwhelming odds, changing the course of the war and history itself. The Winter War. In the bitter cold of November 1939, just months after World War II had officially begun, the Soviet Union launched an unexpected invasion of Finland. This marked the beginning of the Winter War conflict that would pit a massive Red Army against a much smaller, vastly outnumbered Finnish defense force. The Soviets, believing in a swift victory, expected Finland to crumble in a matter of weeks. What followed, however, was a stunning display of Finnish resistance that would captivate the world. The Soviet Union justified its invasion by claiming it needed to secure its borders against potential German aggression. In reality, it sought to push the Finnish border away from Leningrad and establish a sphere of influence in line with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols. When Finland refused to cede territory, Soviet troops poured across the border. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, with over 1 million troops compared to Finland's 300,000, the Red Army struggled. Finnish forces, led by Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, used their intimate knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla-style tactics to devastating effect. Ski troops dressed in white camouflage darted through snowy forests to ambush Soviet columns. The tactic known as Matti, which involved isolating and encircling enemy units in Finland's vast forests, proved especially effective. One of the most legendary figures to emerge from the war was Simo Häyhä, a Finnish sniper credited with over 500 confirmed kills. Using iron sights on his rifle to avoid reflection from a scope, he became a ghost-like figure haunting Soviet troops in the snow-covered woods. Meanwhile, the Soviet military revealed deep flaws in leadership and logistics. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, and poor communication and strategy led to high casualties. Tanks bogged down in forests and snowdrifts, and soldiers often froze to death due to inadequate winter gear. Internationally, sympathy poured in for Finland. Though few nations offered meaningful aid, the global community admired the Finns' determination and courage. The League of Nations even expelled the Soviet Union for its aggression. After 3 brutal months, the Finns were exhausted. Despite their heroic efforts, they couldn't hold out forever. In March 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland was forced to cede about 11% of its territory, including the key region of Karelia, resulting in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Finnish citizens. Yet Finland remained independent, a fact seen by many as a moral victory. The Winter War exposed the Soviet military's weaknesses, but also forced it to adapt. It would prove a valuable, though costly lesson for the Red Army, one it would apply in later stages of World War II. For Finland, the war became a symbol of national unity and resistance, proof that even a small nation could defy a great power, if only for a time. The North African campaign begins. In 1940, the North African desert became a critical theater of World War II, where vast open landscapes hosted fierce battles between the Axis and Allied powers. Initially, Italian forces based in Libya launched an invasion into Egypt, aiming to expand their colonial control and threaten British access to the Suez Canal. But their early offensives were poorly planned and met with strong British resistance. The British launched Operation Compassa surprise counterattack that pushed deep into Libya and decimated the Italian 10th Army, capturing tens of thousands of troops. Alarmed by Italy's failure, Adolf Hitler sent in reinforcements. The newly formed Africa Corps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, quickly earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. Rommel brought aggressive tactics and bold leadership that turned the tide. He drove the British forces back across the Libyan-Egyptian border, capturing key towns like Benghazi and threatening British supply lines. The Desert War quickly became a series of advances and retreats across hundreds of miles of sand, with both sides struggling with logistics, supply shortages, and the brutal heat. Tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry clashed in fast-moving engagements, making it one of the most fluid and dynamic fronts of the war. By 1942, the conflict had reached a stalemate near the Egyptian town of El Alamein. The British, now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, prepared for a decisive offensive. The outcome of this desert struggle would shape the momentum of the war in Europe and determine control over vital oil resources and trade routes. U-boat warfare and the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of World War II, fought to control the vital shipping lanes between North America and Europe. At its core were German U-boats, stealthy submarines tasked with cutting off Britain's supply lines. Sailing in wolf packs, they sank thousands of Allied ships, aiming to starve the British into submission. Early on, the U-boats were devastatingly effective. Convoys were slow, poorly protected, and vulnerable. Ships burned on the horizon night after night. But the Allies fought back, improving sonar, cracking the Enigma code, and closing the mid-Atlantic gap with aircraft and escort carriers. By 1943, the tide turned. The Allies sank hundreds of U-boats, and the once dominant German submariners found themselves outmatched and hunted. In the end, over 70,000 Allied sailors and 30,000 German submariners lost their lives. The battle was long, brutal, and quiet, but it was essential to winning the war. Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union. In the early hours of June the 22nd, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers surged across the border into the Soviet Union. This was Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. It marked a turning point in World War II and shattered the fragile non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. For months, the Germans had meticulously planned the assault, dividing their forces into three massive army groups: North, Center, and South, each with a specific target: Leningrad, Moscow, and the resource-rich lands of Ukraine. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly under the weight of the Blitzkrieg. The German war machine, fresh off a string of victories in Western Europe, stormed across the vast Soviet frontier, catching the Red Army off guard. The Luftwaffe bombed Soviet airfields before planes could even take off. In the opening weeks, entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Civilians fled in terror. Towns were leveled. It was chaos. But while the Germans advanced rapidly, the distances were far greater than anything they had experienced in the West. The roads were poor, supply lines stretched thin, and despite early losses, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. Soviet resistance hardened. Scorched earth tactics were used. Villages, bridges, crops, anything of use to the enemy, were burned to the ground. Stalin called for total war. Factories were moved east of the Ural Mountains, out of German reach, and production continued around the clock. As summer gave way to autumn, German troops pushed closer to Moscow. But their advance slowed. Mud from the autumn rains turned roads into swamps, bogging down vehicles and delaying supplies. And then came the Russian winter, brutal, unforgiving, and unanticipated. German troops lacked proper winter clothing. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and the Soviets, now reinforced and regrouped, launched a fierce counteroffensive. Operation Barbarossa, once envisioned as a swift and decisive campaign, had become a war of attrition. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet Union's resilience and overextended his own army. By the end of 1941, the Germans were halted outside Moscow, having failed to deliver the knockout blow they had promised. The Eastern Front was now a frozen, bloody stalemate. And for the first time, the tide of the war began to turn against Nazi Germany. Part 4. Global Conflict. Pearl Harbor and the U.S. enters the war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday in Hawaii was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. At 7:48 a.m. local time, hundreds of Japanese warplanes descended on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Without warning, bombs and torpedoes tore through battleships, destroyers, and airfields. In just under 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 1,200 were wounded. And a significant portion of the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. The USS Arizona exploded and sank with over 1,000 men aboard. Smoke billowed into the sky. The sound of machine gun fire, explosions, and screaming men echoed across the harbor. The attack was not just a surprise. It was a calculated strike meant to cripple the United States' ability to project power in the Pacific. Japanese military leaders believed that by eliminating the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one swift blow, they could secure unchallenged control over Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. What they underestimated was the resolve the attack would awaken. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a stunned nation. His voice was somber, deliberate. He described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. Before a joint session of Congress, he called for a declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. Congress responded with near unanimity. Only one vote dissented, or the United States was officially at war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States. America, in turn, declared war on them. What had started as a regional conflict in Europe and Asia had now become a truly global war, with the United States fully engaged on both fronts. Factories across the country roared to life. Young men enlisted in droves. The American people, once hesitant to join the war, were now galvanized. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. Japanese offensives in the Pacific. In the early months of World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a series of rapid, coordinated offensives across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. These were not random attacks, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to seize key territories, secure vital resources, and establish a defensive perimeter that would be difficult for the Allies to breach. Just hours after striking Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces began their assault on the Philippines. American and Filipino troops under General Douglas MacArthur were caught off guard. Despite their resistance, Japanese forces quickly advanced. By January 1942, they had taken Manila, and the remaining Allied forces were pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. The infamous Bataan Death March followed, during which tens of thousands of prisoners of war were forced to march over 60 miles in brutal conditions, leading to thousands of deaths. Around the same time, Japanese troops invaded British Malaya from the north, crossing through the jungles of Thailand. The British had expected an attack by sea and were unprepared for a land invasion. The Japanese moved swiftly, utilizing bicycles to move through the dense terrain and overwhelming British forces. In just over 2 months, they had captured the entire Malayan Peninsula. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was a massive blow to the British Empire, often described as the worst defeat in British military history. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops were taken prisoner. Singapore, once thought to be an impregnable fortress, fell in just a week of fighting. Meanwhile, Japanese forces also targeted the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, rich in oil and rubber, resources Japan desperately needed. They swiftly overwhelmed the colonial defenses, defeating Allied naval forces in battles like the Battle of the Java Sea and occupying key islands. Burma was next. Japanese troops pushed through to threaten British India and cut off the Burma Road, a vital supply line to China. The campaign in Burma also introduced new challenges. Jungle warfare, disease, and the extreme weather made fighting particularly brutal. In the Pacific Islands, Japan seized Guam, Wake Island, and the Gilbert Islands, expanding its defensive ring. These quick victories stunned the Allies. Within 6 months, Japan had captured a vast empire, stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, and from the Indian border in the west to the Central Pacific. What made these offensives so successful was Japan's ability to strike quickly, exploit weaknesses, and use superior coordination between its army, navy, and air force. But this rapid expansion also stretched Japan thin, setting the stage for fierce counterattacks by the Allies in the years to come. Battle of Midway. In June 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan clashed in what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. Japan, seeking to eliminate the U.S. as a strategic power in the Pacific, planned to lure American aircraft carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll. They hoped to destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure dominance over the Pacific Ocean. But the Japanese plan had a critical flaw. It wasn't a secret. Thanks to American cryptanalysts who had broken Japan's naval codes, U.S. commanders knew the attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush of his own, positioning his forces near Midway and waiting for the Japanese to arrive. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft bombed the island, while their fleet, including 4 aircraft carriers, stayed nearby. Unknown to them, 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, were already in position. Throughout the day, waves of American torpedo bombers and dive bombers launched relentless attacks. The early torpedo squadrons suffered catastrophic losses. Planes were shot down before they could even get close to the enemy carriers. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The Japanese defensive formations were drawn to low altitude, leaving their carriers exposed. Soon after, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown struck. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Later, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also found and destroyed. The Japanese lost over 3,000 men, 4 carriers, and hundreds of aircraft. In contrast, the U.S. lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and around 300 personnel. It was a stunning reversal. Japan had entered the war with a vastly superior navy, but after Midway, it would never regain the strategic initiative. From this point forward, the United States began a steady, island-by-island campaign toward Japan. The Battle of Midway didn't just halt Japanese expansion, it marked the moment when the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn. It proved the importance of intelligence, carrier warfare, and the willingness to take bold risks. In just a few hours, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted dramatically, and the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. Siege of Leningrad. In the autumn of 1941, the German army reached the outskirts of Leningrad, of the Soviet Union's most vital cities culturally, industrially, and symbolically. Rather than launch a direct assault, Hitler ordered a siege. The goal wasn't just to capture the city, it was to starve it into submission, erase it from the map, and annihilate its population. For nearly 900 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Supply lines were severed, railroads destroyed, food shipments halted. The city's 3 million residents, including hundreds of thousands of children, were trapped. As winter set in, food rations plummeted to as little as 125 grams of bread per day, often mixed with sawdust to stretch the supply. People boiled leather belts and glue to survive. Entire families froze to death in unheated apartments. The death toll was staggering. It's estimated that over 1 million civilians perished, not from bombs or bullets, but from hunger, disease, and cold. Yet despite unimaginable suffering, the city never surrendered. Factories continued to produce weapons. Artists, writers, and musicians kept working. Shostakovich composed his 7th Symphony inside the besieged city, and it was performed in Leningrad itself in 1942, broadcast by loudspeakers as a symbol of defiance. Meanwhile, the Soviet army mounted a desperate and costly effort to break the siege. The only lifeline was the Road of Life, a route across the frozen Lake Ladoga. Trucks, sleds, and even ice skaters carried food and supplies across the ice under constant German bombardment. It was dangerous and barely sufficient, but it kept the city alive. The siege was finally broken in early 1944 when Soviet forces pushed back the German army. Leningrad emerged devastated, scarred by hunger and death, but unbroken. The city's endurance became a symbol of Soviet resilience and sacrifice. It was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history, a dark testament to the horrors of war and the strength of the human spirit. The Battle of El Alamein. The Battle of El Alamein was a critical turning point in the North African campaign of World War II, taking place between October 23rd and November 11th, 1942. It marked the first major Allied victory against the Axis powers on land. Before this battle, the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had made significant advances across North Africa, threatening British-controlled Egypt, and by extension, the Suez Canal, a vital artery for Allied supply lines. By mid-1942, Rommel's forces had pushed the British Eighth Army back to a defensive line near El Alamein, just 66 miles from Alexandria. The British, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, decided to make a stand. Montgomery had spent months building up his forces, stockpiling weapons, fuel, and food, while also improving morale and discipline among his troops. He understood that the battle had to be a decisive blow, not a temporary setback for the Axis. The battle began with a massive artillery bombardment, followed by a coordinated infantry and armored assault. The desert terrain was harsh, filled with minefields, barbed wire, and fortified Axis positions. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox for his tactical brilliance, was not present during the early days of the battle due to illness, which may have affected the Axis response. Still, the fighting was intense and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Over several days, Montgomery's methodical strategy of attrition wore down the Axis defenses. British forces systematically breached minefields, nicknamed the Devil's Gardens, and outmaneuvered German and Italian units. By early November, Rommel realized his forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of encirclement. He ordered a retreat westward toward Tunisia. The victory at El Alamein was more than just a battlefield success. It ended the string of Axis victories in North Africa and marked the beginning of a broader Allied offensive. Winston Churchill famously declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The psychological boost it gave to the Allies was immense, and it set the stage for the Allied invasion of North Africa in Operation Torch just days later. The tide of the war in Africa had definitively turned. The Guadalcanal Campaign. The Guadalcanal Campaign was one of the first major offensives by Allied forces against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific Theater, and it marked a turning point in World War II. It began in August 1942, just months after the pivotal Battle of Midway, and represented the start of the United States strategy of island hopping, seizing strategic islands, and using them as stepping stones to move closer to Japan. Guadalcanal itself is one of the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield there, which posed a serious threat to Allied supply and communication lines between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. American planners quickly realized the strategic importance of the island and launched a surprise amphibious assault to capture it. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on the island, catching the Japanese off guard. Initially, the invasion went relatively smoothly, with the Marines quickly seizing the unfinished airfield, later named Henderson Field. But what followed was 6 months of brutal combat, both on land and at sea. The Japanese launched repeated attempts to retake the island, leading to a series of deadly naval battles, including the Battle of Savo Island, the Battle of Cape Esperance, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Both sides suffered heavy losses, especially in night engagements, where the Japanese Navy initially had the upper hand. On land, the Americans faced fierce resistance, difficult jungle terrain, and supply shortages. The Japanese launched repeated assaults on the marine perimeter around Henderson Field, often fighting to the death. Disease, especially malaria and dysentery, plagued both sides, and became as much an enemy as the opposing soldiers. As the campaign dragged on into late 1942 and early 1943, the tide began to turn. The United States managed to reinforce its troops and secure naval dominance in the surrounding waters. By February 1943, the Japanese made the difficult decision to evacuate their remaining forces from the island, marking the first major strategic defeat for Japan in the Pacific War. The victory at Guadalcanal had enormous significance. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, gave the Allies a crucial foothold in the Pacific, and boosted morale at a critical time. It also signaled a shift in momentum from defensive battles to a long, grinding Allied advance across the Pacific toward Japan. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal in logistics, jungle warfare, and amphibious operations would shape the rest of the Pacific campaign. Allied bombing campaigns in Europe. Throughout World War II, the Allied bombing campaigns in Europe played a crucial role in weakening Nazi Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. These campaigns began in earnest in 1940 and escalated dramatically after the United States entered the war in 1941. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, initially focused on precision bombing, but quickly shifted to area bombing under Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris. The goal was to destroy German industry and infrastructure, but also to break the morale of the civilian population. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, joined the bombing efforts with a different philosophy. Daylight precision bombing of military and industrial targets, using heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. The RAF bombed at night, and the Americans bombed during the day, forming what became known as the Combined Bomber Offensive. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were subjected to massive aerial bombardment. One of the most devastating attacks was Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, where Hamburg was firebombed for 8 consecutive days. The resulting firestorm destroyed entire neighborhoods and killed an estimated 40,000 people. Similarly, the bombing of Dresden in February 1945 remains one of the most controversial actions of the war. The RAF and USAAF dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries, creating a firestorm that engulfed the city center and caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths. While these bombing campaigns crippled German industrial output, they also raised ethical questions about the targeting of civilian areas. Precision was often difficult to achieve with the technology of the time, and entire cities were razed in the process of targeting factories, rail yards, or military installations. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and transportation hubs were prime targets. And by 1944, the Allies had severely limited Germany's ability to produce fuel and transport supplies. Despite high losses among bomber crews, especially before the widespread use of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign forced Germany to divert significant resources to anti-aircraft defenses, fighter planes, and repairing damaged infrastructure. By the end of the war, many German cities were in ruins, and the Luftwaffe was largely grounded due to lack of fuel and aircraft. The Allied bombing campaigns remain a subject of historical debate, balancing the military necessity of defeating Nazi Germany with the humanitarian consequences of civilian casualties and urban destruction. Nevertheless, these operations significantly contributed to the weakening of the Third Reich and the eventual Allied victory in Europe. Resistance movements and espionage in occupied Europe. As Nazi control tightened its grip, resistance movements began to form. Quiet at first, scattered and improvised, but soon they became networks of defiance, sabotage, and survival. These were not organized armies with uniforms and tanks, but farmers, students, teachers, and workers, all risking everything to fight back. From the forests of Poland to the streets of Paris, they operated in shadow-shotting weapons, smuggling information, derailing trains, and assassinating collaborators. In France, the resistance grew from underground newspapers and small sabotage acts into a full-fledged force that would one day rise to assist the Allies during the liberation. In the Soviet Union, partisan fighters waged a brutal guerrilla war behind German lines disrupting supply chains and harassing retreating forces. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans became a powerful army in their own right, fiercely battling the Axis, and eventually playing a decisive role in liberating the region. Behind the scenes, two newly formed intelligence agencies, the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, were orchestrating much of the covert war. The SOE, famously instructed by Churchill to set Europe ablaze, trained agents to infiltrate enemy territory, organize resistance cells, and carry out sabotage missions. These operatives parachuted into France, Norway, Greece, and beyond, often working with locals and relying on coded radio messages and secret drop zones. The OSS, precursor to the CIA, coordinated with the SOE and local resistance movements, gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemy operations, and planning psychological warfare. They recruited a diverse mix of linguists, scientists, escape artists, and even Hollywood filmmakers to help craft deceptive operations. Many of these missions were dangerous, and the cost was often high. Captured agents were tortured and executed. Entire villages were massacred in retaliation for resistance activity. But despite the risks, the resistance didn't stop. Their courage helped pave the way for D-Day and the ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany. And though their victories weren't always on the front pages or battlefield maps, their impact was immense, woven into the very heart of how World War II was won. Captured agents were tortured and executed. Entire villages were massacred in retaliation for resistance activity. But despite the risks, the resistance didn't stop. Their courage helped pave the way for D-Day and the ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany. And though their victories weren't always on the front pages or battlefield maps, their impact was immense, woven into the very heart of how World War II was won. Part 5. Turning the Tide, the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most brutal and pivotal battles in human history. Fought between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany from August 1942 to February 1943, it marked the turning point of the Eastern Front and arguably the entire war. Hitler had ordered the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus to capture the city, not just for strategic reasons, but for symbolic ones. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name, and taking it would be a massive psychological victory. The city, located on the western bank of the Volga River, was a major industrial center. Its capture would give Germany control over the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off vital Soviet supply lines. But what was intended to be a swift campaign turned into a nightmare of urban warfare. The German Luftwaffe bombed the city into rubble, ironically creating the perfect terrain for Soviet defenders. Street by street, house by house, room by room, soldiers fought over factories, rail yards, and apartment blocks. It became a grinding, close-quarter slog where snipers, ambushes, and desperation reigned. Soviet forces under the command of General Vasily Trikov dug in and refused to give ground. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, and civilians, many of them starving and freezing, endured hellish conditions. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranos, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. Hitler forbade a retreat, trapping over 250,000 Axis troops inside the city. Supplies dwindled, temperatures plunged, and morale collapsed. Paulus eventually surrendered in February 1943, in direct defiance of Hitler's expectations. Of the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who entered Stalingrad, only a fraction returned home. The Soviet victory was staggering, not just for its tactical brilliance, but for what it represented. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, galvanized the Allied powers, and set the Soviet Red Army on a westward path that wouldn't stop until Berlin. Stalingrad wasn't just a military battle. It was a clash of ideologies, egos, and wills. The human cost was unfathomable, over 2 million casualties, soldiers and civilians alike. It was a victory carved out of rubble and blood, and it changed the course of history. The Italian campaign and the fall of Mussolini. In 1943, the tide of World War II was beginning to shift. The Allies had secured a key victory in North Africa, and attention now turned to southern Europe. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, was seen as the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. The plan was to invade the Italian peninsula and knock one of Germany's key allies out of the war. The campaign began with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, known as Operation Husky. British and American forces landed on the island in a massive amphibious and airborne assault. German and Italian resistance was fierce, but the Allies moved quickly, capturing key positions and forcing the Axis to evacuate. The success of the Sicily campaign directly contributed to political upheaval in Italy. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini and had him arrested. The fascist regime, which had ruled Italy for over 2 decades, crumbled overnight. A new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio was formed, and it secretly began negotiating an armistice with the Allies. In September 1943, the Allies landed on mainland Italy at Salerno, while simultaneously announcing the Italian surrender. But this did not mean an easy victory. German forces quickly took control of northern and central Italy, disarmed Italian troops, and established strong defensive positions. Mussolini, rescued by German commandos from his prison in the mountains, was installed as the head of a puppet regime in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic. The Italian campaign would go on for nearly 2 more years. It was marked by grueling mountain warfare, slow advances, and heavy casualties. Battles like Monte Cassino and Anzio became infamous for their intensity. The terrain favored the defenders, and the Germans made use of a series of fortified lines, the most formidable being the Gustav Line. Despite the challenges, the Allies slowly pushed north. In April 1945, they launched a final offensive. As Allied forces closed in, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland, but was captured by Italian partisans. On April 28, he was executed, and his body was displayed in Milan, a stark symbol of the end of fascism in Italy. The fall of Mussolini was not just the collapse of a dictatorship. It signaled a major political transformation in Italy and weakened Hitler's position in Europe. The Italian campaign, though overshadowed by events in France and the Eastern Front, was a crucial part of the Allied effort to defeat the Axis powers. D-Day, Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history began as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in a massive effort to liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation. Over 156,000 troops from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other Allied nations landed across 5 code-named beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. In the early hours before the beach landings, thousands of paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with British and Canadian airborne units, were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt German defenses, capture key bridges, and sow confusion. The operation was shrouded in deception. The Allies had spent months feeding false intelligence to the Germans, convincing them that the invasion would take place at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. At dawn, naval bombardments and aerial attacks targeted German fortifications along the coast. The landings began in earnest, and each beach presented its own challenges. At Utah Beach, American forces landed with relatively few casualties, aided by a current that had accidentally pushed them to a less defended area. But at Omaha Beach, it was a different story. The American soldiers faced heavy machine gun fire, artillery, and entrenched defenses. The first wave suffered devastating losses as they tried to cross open sand with little cover. Still, through sheer determination and reinforcement, they established a foothold. British forces at Gold and Sword beaches and Canadian forces at Juno Beach met stiff resistance but made steady progress inland. By the end of the day, despite high casualties and logistical chaos, the Allies had secured the beaches, and were beginning to link the separate landings into a continuous front. The Germans, caught off guard and slow to respond, could not repel the invasion. D-Day was not just a single-day event. It marked the beginning of Operation Overlord, the broader campaign to free France and push into Nazi-occupied Europe. In the weeks that followed, over 2 million Allied troops would pour into France. Town by town, field by field, they fought their way across Normandy, eventually liberating Paris by August. The success of D-Day came at a high cost, over 10,000 Allied casualties, with more than 4,000 confirmed dead on the first day alone. But it was a turning point. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The Western Front was opened. Hitler's grasp on Europe was starting to crack. The liberation of Europe had begun. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded as one of the most decisive naval battles of World War II. It was a massive engagement between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy, fought near the Mariana Islands. The battle came at a crucial time, just as American forces were launching an assault on Saipan, a key island in the Marianas. The Japanese hoped to draw the U.S. fleet into a large-scale confrontation and deliver a crippling blow that could stall the American advance across the Pacific. The Japanese committed everything they had. They launched over 400 carrier-based aircraft, supported by 9 aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers. The Americans, however, had superior radar technology, well-trained pilots, and a larger number of better aircraft. As Japanese planes approached the U.S. fleet, they were detected early, giving American fighters time to intercept. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In wave after wave, Japanese aircraft were gunned down by U.S. Navy pilots and anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the first day, Japan had lost hundreds of planes and many of its most experienced pilots. It was a devastating loss of air power from which the Japanese Navy would never truly recover. Meanwhile, American submarines prowled beneath the surface, scoring key victories of their own. The Japanese aircraft carriers Taiho and Shokaku were both sunk by U.S. submarines, further weakening Japan's already outmatched naval strength. The battle lasted 2 days, and by the end, the Japanese fleet had lost 3 carriers, nearly 600 aircraft, and thousands of men. In contrast, American losses were relatively light, around 130 aircraft and a few dozen men. The victory gave the United States uncontested air and naval superiority in the Pacific, clearing the way for the invasion of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. It also meant that Japan could no longer launch effective large-scale carrier operations, dramatically shifting the balance of power in the Pacific theater. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a tactical win. It marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as a serious threat. From that point on, the Imperial Navy was largely on the defensive, forced to rely on desperate measures like kamikaze attacks in the months to come. The U.S. march toward Japan would continue, and the path to ultimate victory in the Pacific had become much clearer. The liberation of Paris. In August 1944, after 4 long years under Nazi occupation, the city of Paris prepared to rise. The German military presence had grown increasingly uneasy as Allied forces pushed through Normandy, and rumors spread that the liberation was near. The people of Paris, wary but defiant, began to organize. Strikes erupted, by police, by subway workers, by ordinary citizens, crippling German control over the city. Members of the French resistance, armed with whatever weapons they could find, built barricades in the streets and began skirmishes with German forces. It was not yet the official liberation, but Paris was stirring. The Allied High Command had initially planned to bypass Paris altogether, fearing it would take too many resources to liberate and then defeat the city. But Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, insisted that Paris be freed by French troops. He understood that reclaiming the capital would not only be a strategic victory, it would be a symbolic one. France had to liberate itself in the eyes of the world and its own people. On August 23rd, General Philippe Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division was given the green light to enter the city. Fighting broke out across Paris as resistance forces and Leclerc's troops engaged the Germans. The Luftwaffe bombed resistance strongholds. Tanks rolled down boulevards. Snipers fired from rooftops. But the people of Paris, joined by the Free French and soon American forces, refused to back down. By August 25th, the German military governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, surrendered. Defying Hitler's orders to destroy the city, he chose to preserve it. That same day, Charles de Gaulle entered the city and walked triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring that Paris is liberated. The crowds roared. Flags flew from every window. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in years. Parisians embraced soldiers and strangers alike, tears in their eyes, joy in their hearts. The liberation of Paris was more than a military victory. It was a cultural and emotional climax of the war in Western Europe, a turning point that restored hope, pride, and dignity to an occupied nation. Soviet advances in Eastern Europe. As 1944 progressed, the Soviet Union launched a series of massive offensives that would shift the balance of power in Eastern Europe. After the victory at Stalingrad and the grinding campaign at Kursk, the Red Army had gained momentum. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, was the centerpiece of the Soviet advance. In a matter of weeks, it shattered the German Army Group Center in Belarus, pushing the front line hundreds of miles westward. Entire German divisions were encircled and destroyed, and by the end of the operation, the Soviets had liberated Minsk and were on the doorstep of Poland. As the Red Army surged forward, they began to retake the territories lost in 1941 and push deeper into the Axis-aligned countries. Romania and Bulgaria, once part of the Axis, changed sides as Soviet forces crossed their borders. In Hungary, however, German resistance was fierce, culminating in the brutal siege of Budapest that would stretch into 1945. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Soviet forces clashed with both German troops and local partisans, some of whom resisted the return of Soviet rule. The advancing Soviets also entered Poland, capturing Warsaw in January 1945, after the failed Warsaw Uprising, which the Red Army had controversially failed to support. This move ignited tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, foreshadowing post-war divisions. The Soviet advance was relentless, but it came at a heavy cost. Cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were displaced, and a wave of retribution swept across newly captured territories. The Red Army's liberation of Eastern Europe was also, for many, the beginning of Soviet domination, as pro-Soviet regimes were installed in countries like Poland, Romania, and East Germany. While the Wehrmacht was being pushed back toward Berlin, a new geopolitical reality was forming in its wake, one that would soon crystallize into the Cold War: the strategic bombing of Germany. By early 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse. But the Allies believed that sustained pressure from the air could accelerate the end of the war. One of the most controversial aspects of this strategy was the intensive bombing of German cities, particularly the firebombing of Dresden. The city of Dresden, located in eastern Germany, had long been known for its cultural heritage, its Baroque architecture, art collections, and status as a hub of classical music. At the time, it also held industrial value, with factories producing military equipment and materials that supported the German war effort. But unlike heavily fortified cities such as Berlin or Hamburg, Dresden had been largely untouched by major bombing campaigns until February 1945. On the night of February 13th, waves of British RAF bombers began dropping thousands of incendiary bombs on the city. The initial strikes were designed to destroy rooftops and ignite fires. A second wave followed a few hours later, targeting the same areas to intensify the blaze. The next day, American B-17 bombers struck again in broad daylight, compounding the destruction. The resulting firestorm engulfed much of the city center, with temperatures reaching over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Buildings were flattened, streets melted, Entire neighborhoods were incinerated. Estimates of the death toll vary widely. Hence, some early reports claimed hundreds of thousands had died, but modern historians generally place the number between 25,000 and 35,000. Many of the victims were civilians, including refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The attack left deep scars, not just physical, but psychological, and sparked a fierce debate that continues to this day. Supporters of the bombing argue that it was a military necessity aimed at crippling German infrastructure, demoralizing the enemy, and shortening the war. Critics argue it was disproportionate, targeting a city with limited strategic value at a time when Germany's defeat was imminent. The destruction of Dresden became a symbol of the moral complexities of total war, the blurred lines between military objectives and humanitarian costs. In the years after the war, Dresden's ruins stood as a haunting reminder of the bombing. Some buildings were left untouched as silent memorials. Others, like the Frauenkirche, were painstakingly rebuilt, stone by stone. Today, the debate over Dresden endures, reflecting larger questions about wartime ethics, the cost of victory, and the fine line between justice and vengeance. The Battle of the Bulge. In the final months of 1944, as the Allies believed the war in Europe was nearing its end, Adolf Hitler launched one last desperate offensive. The goal? To split the British and American forces, capture the strategic port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. What followed was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, under cover of dense fog and snow, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surged through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Allies had considered this region too rugged for a major offensive, leaving it lightly defended. The surprise attack created a literal bulge in the Allied front lines, giving the battle its name. At first, the Germans made rapid gains, overwhelming American positions, capturing thousands of troops and sowing chaos. The weather grounded Allied air support, which had been crucial in earlier victories. Bastogne, a small Belgian town held by the 101st Airborne Division, became a symbol of resistance. Surrounded by German forces and facing freezing conditions, the American defenders refused to surrender. When asked to do so, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: nuts. As the skies cleared in late December, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. Supplies were dropped to encircle troops, and bombers struck German positions. Reinforcements arrived, including General Patton's Third Army, which raced north in a dramatic counteroffensive. The Germans, short on fuel and facing stiff resistance, began to falter. By mid-January 1945, the Allies had pushed the Germans back to their original lines. The offensive had failed, but at a terrible cost. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. German losses were similarly catastrophic, depleting their reserves and ensuring they could never launch another major attack in the West. The Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It delayed the Allied advance, but ultimately hastened the collapse of the Third Reich. The resilience and sacrifice shown in those freezing forests would become one of the most enduring stories of American courage in the war. The Yalta Conference. In February 1945, as the Second World War was entering its final stages in Europe, the leaders of the Allied powers, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union met in the Crimean resort town of Yalta. Their goal was to discuss the reorganization of post-war Europe and to lay the groundwork for lasting peace. Though they were united in their desire to defeat Nazi Germany, each leader arrived at Yalta with different priorities, shaped by national interests and geopolitical concerns. One of the major outcomes of the Yalta Conference was the agreement on the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and the subsequent division of Germany into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Berlin, the capital, would also be divided into 4 sectors. despite being located deep within the Soviet zone. This arrangement would later become a focal point of Cold War tensions. The leaders also agreed that liberated countries in Europe would be allowed to hold free elections to determine their future governments. This included countries like Poland, which had been heavily affected by the war and occupation. However, this point would become a major source of controversy, as Stalin later imposed communist regimes across Eastern Europe, contrary to the spirit of democratic self-determination discussed at Yalta. Another significant topic was the formation of a new international organization to replace the failed League of Nations. The leaders reached consensus on establishing the United Nations, designed to promote global cooperation and prevent future conflicts. They agreed on key structural details, including the Security Council and the inclusion of permanent members with veto power. The conference also addressed the ongoing war in the Pacific. Stalin pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. In return, the Soviets would regain territories lost during the Russo-Japanese War, including southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Though hailed at the time as a moment of Allied unity, the Yalta Conference was the beginning of the post-war order that would soon divide the world into competing ideological camps. The promises made at Yalta, particularly regarding Eastern Europe, quickly unraveled, contributing to the onset of the Cold War. What was meant to be a blueprint for peace also sowed the seeds of a new prolonged global standoff. Allies invade Germany. By early 1945, the writing was on the wall for Nazi Germany. The Allies had already liberated France and much of Western Europe. To the east, the Soviet Red Army had pushed through Poland and was approaching Berlin. Now the final act of the European theater was about to begin, the invasion of Germany itself. American, British, and French forces gathered near the western borders of Germany, preparing to cross the Rhine River, one of the last major natural obstacles before entering the German heartland. In March 1945, the Allies seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, giving them a crucial foothold east of the Rhine. It was a surprising and strategically vital moment. The Germans had tried to demolish the bridge to slow the Allies down, but it held just long enough. Once the Rhine was crossed, the Western Allies advanced rapidly. American forces under General Patton swept through the south, while Montgomery's British and Canadian troops moved through the north. Town after town fell to the advancing forces. The German military, depleted and desperate, was unable to mount a unified defense. Resistance was fierce in places, but the tide was unstoppable. Meanwhile, German civilians were experiencing the brutal reality of war. Cities were bombed, infrastructure destroyed, and millions were displaced. Many had hoped for a negotiated peace, but Hitler refused to surrender. As the Allies pushed deeper, they began to uncover the full horror of Nazi crimes, liberating concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. Soldiers were stunned by the scale of the atrocities they found. As April began, the Allies were closing in from both sides. The Soviets were on the outskirts of Berlin, and the Americans were advancing from the west. Although there was some coordination between the Allies and the Soviets, both sides raced to capture territory. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The invasion of Germany was not just a military operation. It was the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. Hitler, isolated and delusional in his Berlin bunker, issued orders to destroy German infrastructure rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But many German commanders ignored these orders, recognizing the war was lost. As Allied forces took more ground, the German government collapsed. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Just over a week later, on May 7, Germany officially surrendered. The invasion of Germany had brought the most destructive war in human history to a close, at least in Europe. The fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide. By April 1945, Berlin was a city on the edge of collapse. The Soviet Red Army had encircled the German capital, and artillery shells rained down day and night. Street by street, building by building, Soviet forces pressed inward, meeting desperate resistance from the remnants of the German Wehrmacht, SS troops, and even Hitler Youth. Hitler, by then a shadow of his former self, had retreated deep into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Isolated, paranoid, and increasingly unhinged, he clung to illusions of last-minute salvation that would never come. Inside the bunker, Hitler held tense meetings with his remaining generals, berating them for failing to carry out orders that were militarily impossible. Control maps spread across the table showed units that no longer existed. The Allies had already taken much of Western Germany, and Berlin was surrounded. The fantasy of a counterattack from General Vink's 12th Army persisted until the bitter end. Despite the obvious reality, there was no army coming to the rescue. As Soviet troops closed in, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony on April 29th. That same night, he dictated his last will and political testament, blaming the Jews for the war and urging future generations to continue the struggle. The next day, April 30th, 1945, he said goodbye to the remaining occupants of the bunker. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva retreated to his private room. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. Hitler had shot himself in the head while Eva took cyanide. Their bodies were discovered shortly after by aides, who quickly doused them in petrol and set them alight in the garden outside the bunker, following Hitler's final instructions. The fall of Berlin was swift after that. On May 2nd, the city officially surrendered. Less than a week later, on May 8th, Nazi Germany capitulated unconditionally. The man who had plunged the world into its most catastrophic war was gone. And with him, the Third Reich crumbled into ruins. The cost had been staggering: tens of millions dead, entire cities obliterated, and the horrors of the Holocaust revealed in full. Yet, in the smoking rubble of Berlin, a new world was about to begin. Germany surrenders. By early May 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse. Allied forces were advancing from the west, and Soviet troops had already entered Berlin from the east. The once mighty Wehrmacht was shattered, its soldiers surrendering en masse, or attempting to flee westward to avoid capture by the Red Army. Hitler was dead. He had taken his own life in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. In the vacuum that followed, Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed as his successor, scrambled to negotiate a peace deal with the Western Allies, while continuing to resist Soviet forces. But there was no longer any leverage. The war in Europe was lost. On May 7, 1945, at 2:41 a.m., in a small red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, which served as General Eisenhower's headquarters, the German High Command signed an unconditional surrender. The signatories included General Alfred Jodl, who represented the German armed forces, and General Walter Bedell Smith on behalf of the Allies. The terms were clear. All active operations were to cease by 11:01 p.m. on May 8th. Despite the formal surrender in Reims, the Soviets demanded a separate, more ceremonious signing in Berlin. On May 8th, in the shattered capital, representatives of the German military once again signed the surrender document, this time in the presence of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Allied representatives. The act was both symbolic and strategic, ensuring that the Soviet Union's massive sacrifices in the war were properly acknowledged. When the news broke, it triggered celebrations around the world. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, New York, and countless other cities. In Times Square, strangers embraced and danced. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation, declaring victory in Europe even as he reminded the public that the war against Japan still raged on. King George VI gave a solemn address from Buckingham Palace, and two young women, Princess Elizabeth and her sister Margaret, slipped anonymously into the cheering crowds to join the festivities. But amid the joy, there was also grief. Millions had died. Entire cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered. The Holocaust had been exposed in full, horrifying detail. Soldiers and civilians alike carried scars invisible, others buried deep within. For many, peace brought not relief, but a sobering reckoning with all that had been lost. Still, May 8, 1945 marked a turning point. After nearly 6 years of the most destructive war in human history, the guns in Europe had finally fallen silent. It was Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. And though the world had been forever changed, there was at last a fragile hope that the future might be built anew. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the closing days of World War II, the world witnessed an event unlike anything before it enacted that would not only hasten the end of the war, but fundamentally reshape the nature of conflict and global politics for generations. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay released a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Within seconds, the bomb detonated approximately 600 meters above the city, unleashing a blinding flash and a shockwave that flattened buildings, ignited fires, and claimed tens of thousands of lives in an instant. The destruction was total and unprecedented. Hiroshima, a city of military and industrial significance, was transformed into a wasteland. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks and months from radiation sickness, burns, and injuries. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable, horror-charred bodies, people wandering in silence with their skin hanging in strips, and a city consumed by fire. Despite the overwhelming devastation, Japan did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was even more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. But Nagasaki's geography, with its surrounding hills, somewhat limited the scale of destruction. Still, approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly, with the death toll rising in the weeks that followed. The psychological and political impact of the bombings was immediate. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people directly for the first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. The use of atomic bombs remains one of the most controversial decisions in history. Supporters argue it was necessary to bring the war to a swift end and avoid a bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland that could have cost millions of lives. Critics contend Japan was already on the brink of surrender and that the bombings were a demonstration of power aimed in part at the Soviet Union. What is certain is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the dawn of the nuclear age. For the first time, humanity had created a weapon capable of wiping out entire cities in moments. The legacy of these bombings lives on in the survivors, the hibakusha, and in the global movement for nuclear disarmament. The shadow of the mushroom cloud remains a reminder of both the horror of war and the terrifying power humans have placed in their own hands. Japan surrenders. By August 1945, Japan stood on the brink of total collapse. Its cities lay in ruins from relentless Allied bombing, its navy shattered, and its people starving. Yet despite the grim reality, the Japanese military leadership clung to hope that a negotiated peace might preserve the emperor's position and stave off unconditional surrender. Then came the final blows. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare on the city of Hiroshima. In a flash, tens of thousands were incinerated. Fires raged across the city. On all ends, shockwaves leveled buildings. The survivors spoke of a silent flash, a wave of heat, and a haunting black rain. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, with similar devastation. These were not just bombs. They were a message. The world had entered a new and terrifying era. But that wasn't all. On the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union, honoring an agreement made at the Yalta Conference, invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. The once mighty Kwantung Army was overwhelmed in days. Japan now faced a two-front war against both the Americans and the Soviets. With no hope of victory, inside Tokyo, a fierce debate erupted. The military wanted to fight on to resist invasion and die with honor. But Emperor Hirohito made a historic decision. For the first time, he stepped in directly to break the deadlock. On August 15, 1945, in a radio address heard by the Japanese people, many, for the first time hearing their emperor's voice, Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender. He spoke not of defeat, but of enduring the unendurable to spare his people from further suffering. Across Japan, there was disbelief, sorrow, and in some cases, defiance. Some military officers attempted coups to prevent the surrender, but they failed. The war was over. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the official instrument of surrender before representatives of the Allied powers. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. The deck was silent, the mood somber. The most devastating war in human history had finally come to an end. VJ Day, Victory over Japan, Day marked not just the end of World War II, but the dawn of a new world order. The atomic age had begun. The United States emerged as a superpower, and Japan, humbled and broken, would begin a long path toward rebuilding, not through conquest, but through peace. The Nuremberg Trials. After the guns fell silent and the Third Reich lay in ruins, the world faced a monumental question. How should justice be served to those responsible for the unprecedented horrors of the war? The answer came in the form of the Nuremberg Trials, a series of military tribunals held from 1945 to 1946, where top Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 24 high-ranking officials stood accused, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop. They were not judged by a single country, but by an international tribunal composed of representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. The goal was not vengeance, but the establishment of a legal precedent that individuals, even heads of state, could be held accountable for atrocities committed under the guise of state policy. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Mountains of documents, footage from liberated concentration camps, and testimony from survivors painted a damning picture of systematic genocide, forced labor, and aggressive war planning. For the first time in history, the term genocide entered legal discourse, and the Holocaust was laid bare before the world in excruciating detail. The defense argued that the accused were following orders, or acting under the laws of their own country. But the tribunal rejected this reasoning, affirming that moral responsibility transcends national command. In the end, 12 defendants were sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted, and the rest received varying prison terms. The Nuremberg Trials marked a turning point in international law. They helped birth the modern concept of human rights and paved the way for future courts like The Hague. More importantly, they delivered a message that still echoes decades later. Crimes against humanity will not be forgotten, and justice, even if delayed, can still be served. The United Nations is formed. In the aftermath of World War II, the world stood at a crossroads. The devastation of the conflict had left tens of millions dead, cities reduced to rubble, and entire economies shattered. But out of the ruins, a new vision emerged, one that sought to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The idea of an international organization to promote peace had been discussed during the war, but now it was time to make it real. In April 1945, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to draft a new charter. These countries had all, in one way or another, been aligned against the Axis powers. Their mission was clear: to create a global body that would ensure international cooperation, uphold human rights, and stop future wars before they began. After weeks of negotiation, the United Nations Charter was signed on June 26, 1945, and the United Nations officially came into existence on October 24th of that year. The United Nations was designed to be more effective than its predecessor, the League of Nations, which had failed to prevent World War II. It featured a Security Council with 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China wielding veto power. This structure aimed to reflect the new geopolitical reality and prevent unilateral dominance by any one power. Beyond security, the United Nations would go on to play a crucial role in humanitarian aid, development, and the promotion of human rights. Organizations like UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the UNHCR became central to global efforts in improving lives and managing crises. Though not without its flaws and controversies, the formation of the UN marked a turning point in history, a global commitment forged in the ashes of war to strive for a more peaceful and cooperative world. The division of Germany and the Cold War begins. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the victorious Allied powers faced the monumental task of rebuilding a devastated Europe and determining the fate of the defeated Axis nations. Germany in particular became the epicenter of post-war geopolitical tension. The country was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the main Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Berlin, though deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly split into 4 sectors. Initially, this division was presented as a temporary measure. But it soon became clear that deeper ideological differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were surfacing. The Western powers favored democratic governments and capitalist economies, while the Soviet Union sought to expand its sphere of influence and establish pro-Soviet communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Tensions escalated as Stalin tightened control over Eastern Bloc countries, and Western leaders grew increasingly alarmed at the spread of communism. Germany became a symbol of this growing divide. In 1948, when the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their zones to stabilize the economy, the Soviets responded with the Berlin blockade, cutting off all land and rail access to West Berlin. In response, the Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation that flew food, fuel, and supplies into the city for nearly a year. The blockade failed, but it cemented the rift between East and West. In 1949, the 3 western zones of Germany were merged into the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, while the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. 2 separate German states now existed, each aligned with opposing global powers. That same year, the Western Allies formed NATO, a military alliance to counter Soviet influence. In turn, the Soviet Union would eventually create its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. These developments marked the beginning of the Cold War, a decades-long period of political hostility, arms races, and proxy conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though the 2 superpowers never engaged in direct military combat with each other, the world lived under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. Germany, divided and fortified, became the front line of this global standoff. The Berlin Wall would later rise in 1961, physically manifesting the ideological divide that had been growing since the war's end. What began as a cooperative victory over fascism had turned into a frozen conflict, and the scars of that division would shape world politics for generations to come. Impact on civilians and the Holocaust. World War II wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a war that tore through the lives of ordinary people across the globe. Civilians weren't bystanders, they were often right in the crosshairs. Cities were bombed into ruins, families displaced, and entire communities erased. In places like London, constant air raids forced people into underground shelters night after night, never knowing if their homes would still be standing by morning. In the Soviet Union, scorched earth tactics left towns desolate, as millions were forced to flee the advancing front lines. Food shortages, disease, and cold became weapons in themselves, slowly grinding people down. In occupied territories, life was even more brutal. Civilians lived under the thumb of harsh regimes, often subject to curfews, rationing, forced labor, and mass arrests. In Poland, the Netherlands, and parts of the Balkans, towns were terrorized by Nazi crackdowns, and entire neighborhoods were emptied overnight. Acts of resistance were met with collective punishment, and it wasn't uncommon for hundreds to be executed in retaliation for the actions of a few. But the darkest chapter of the war, the one that defines its horror more than any battle, was the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered, not in the chaos of war, but through a systematic, industrialized effort to wipe them from existence. It began with laws and discrimination, moved to ghettos and forced deportations, and ended in gas chambers. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Soberbornums that echo with unspeakable suffering. These weren't just death camps. They were factories of genocide. The Nazis didn't stop with the Jews. The Holocaust also targeted Roma people, the disabled, LGBTQ+ individuals, Slavic populations, political dissidents, and countless others who didn't fit the twisted vision of a pure society. Children were ripped from their families. Medical experiments were conducted on prisoners without anesthesia. Bodies were reduced to numbers, names to ashes. And yet, amid this unimaginable cruelty, there were sparks of resistance. People hid their neighbors in cellars and attics. Some smuggled food into ghettos or forged documents to help others escape. In doing so, they risked everything. Many paid with their lives. When the war ended, the world was forced to reckon with what it had allowed to happen. Liberating soldiers walked into the camps and found the unthinkable. Mountains of bodies, skeletal survivors, rooms filled with shoes, glasses, and hair. The scale of it all was incomprehensible. Trials were held, leaders were prosecuted, but no sentence could undo the grief of millions. The impact of World War II on civilians was total. There was no safe place, no untouched land. The war changed the meaning of conflict itself, proving that civilians were not just collateral damage. They were central to the violence. And the Holocaust remains a permanent scar on human history, a reminder of what can happen when hatred is institutionalized and indifference prevails. Reconstruction and the Marshall Plan. After the guns fell silent and the ashes of war began to settle, Europe lay in ruins. Cities that once bustled with life were reduced to rubble. Economies had collapsed, and millions of people were displaced, mourning, or on the brink of starvation. The scale of devastation after World War II was almost unimaginable. Roads, railways, factories, and farmland were obliterated. In Germany, Britain, France, Italy, and much of Eastern Europe, infrastructure was either destroyed or barely functional. Hunger and homelessness were widespread. Even victorious nations were struggling to get back on their feet. But amid the wreckage, the United States proposed something unprecedented, sweeping recovery program aimed not only at rebuilding Europe, but also at preventing the rise of extremism and laying the groundwork for a lasting peace. It was called the Marshall Plan, named after U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Announced in 1947, the plan offered massive financial aid to European countries, including Germany, to help them rebuild their economies, restore industry, and modernize infrastructure. The logic behind the Marshall Plan was simple, yet profound. Poverty and despair create fertile ground for authoritarianism. By helping nations recover economically, the U.S. hoped to prevent the spread of communism, particularly as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated into the Cold War. Over 4 years, more than $13 billion, over $100 billion in today's currency, was funneled into Western Europe. This money helped jumpstart production, create jobs, and rebuild cities. Nations like France, West Germany, and the Netherlands experienced rapid growth. The plan wasn't just charity. It was a strategic investment in peace and stability. The Soviet Union and its satellite states rejected the Marshall Plan, viewing it as an attempt by the U.S. to exert influence over Europe. In response, the USSR tightened control over Eastern Europe and established its own system of economic support, though far less effective. The Marshall Plan is widely considered one of the most successful foreign aid programs in history. It helped turn former enemies into allies, laid the economic foundations for the European Union, and strengthened democratic governments across the continent. It transformed the post-war narrative from one of despair to one of recovery and hope. Rebuilding Europe wasn't easy, but the Marshall Plan gave the continent the tools and the belief that it could rise from the ashes stronger than before. Cultural memory in World War II. In film, literature, and education. In the decades following World War II, the conflict became one of the most deeply imprinted events in the global cultural consciousness. From Hollywood films to literature, education, and public memory, the war's legacy continues to shape how nations see themselves and each other. Cinema quickly emerged as one of the most powerful mediums for preserving and interpreting the memory of the war. In the immediate post-war years, films like The Best Years of Our Lives and 12 O'Clock High grappled with the trauma of returning soldiers and the moral ambiguities of combat. In later decades, movies like Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, Dust Boot, and The Pianist offered more visceral human perspectives, showing both the heroism and the horror of war. The war became a canvas for storytelling about sacrifice, resistance, cruelty, and survival. These films often influenced how people who hadn't lived through the war understood it, particularly younger generations. Literature, too, became a vehicle for remembering and processing the war. Novels like Catch-22, Slaughterhouse-Five, and Night Challenge romanticized portrayals, and instead spotlighted the absurdity, brutality, and moral disintegration that war brings. Memoirs, letters, and diaries from soldiers, prisoners, and civilians gave voice to those who lived through the unimaginable. Authors from across the world, in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, wrote from within their national contexts. But the themes often echoed each other: fear, endurance, loss, and the hope for peace. Education systems in many countries incorporated World War II into history curricula. But how the war is taught varies dramatically depending on the country. In the United States, Britain, and much of Western Europe, the war is often framed as a fight against tyranny, with a focus on the Holocaust, D-Day, and the liberation of Europe. In Germany and Japan, the approach is more complex and often self-critical, focusing on the dangers of nationalism and authoritarianism. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, the memory of the war is more fragmented and politicized, sometimes used to support nationalist narratives or suppress uncomfortable truths. Over time, memorials, museums, and annual commemorations have kept the memory of the war alive. Places like Auschwitz, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, and the Normandy beaches are visited by millions seeking to understand what happened and why. Yet cultural memory is never static. As the last survivors pass away, new generations are inheriting a memory of the war, shaped less by personal testimony and more by films, books, and the internet. And today, World War II is not just history. It's mythology, warning, and mirror. It is remembered both as the moment when humanity showed its worst and when it rallied to do its best. Through culture, education, and storytelling, the world continues to wrestle with what the war meant, what it cost, and what lessons, if any, can be truly learned. Bonus topics. The Holocaust. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. It began in the early 1930s, rooted in centuries of anti-Semitism that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party weaponized for political power. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, anti-Semitic rhetoric quickly turned into laws and policies designed to isolate, discriminate against, and dehumanize Jewish people. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, stripping Jews of their citizenship and banning marriages between Jews and non-Jews. These laws institutionalized racial theories central to Nazi ideology. As Germany expanded its territory, annexing Austria in 1938 and occupying Czechoslovakia, anti-Semitic policies followed, and violence escalated. In November 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, marked a turning point. Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes were attacked in a coordinated wave of destruction, and thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. When World War II began, in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, the Nazi regime began mass shootings, forced relocations, and the confinement of Jews in ghettos, especially in cities like Warsaw. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis began implementing what they called the final solution, the plan to annihilate the Jewish people. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the German army, murdering entire Jewish communities in mass shootings and burying the bodies in pits. In late 1941, the Nazis began building extermination camps designed solely for mass murder. These included Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno, and Majdanek, located mostly in occupied Poland. Jews were deported from across Europe in overcrowded trains, often under the false pretense of resettlement. Upon arrival, many were sent directly to gas chambers. Others were forced into slave labor under brutal conditions, often dying from starvation, disease, or mistreatment. The Holocaust reached its deadliest phase between 1942 and 1944. In this period, entire communities were eradicated. Ghettos were liquidated, and resistance was met with brutal force. Yet, even in the darkest circumstances, acts of defiance and resistance occurred, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, where a group of poorly armed Jewish fighters held off the Nazis for nearly a month. As the Allies advanced in 1944 and 1945, they began liberating concentration camps. What they found shocked the world. Emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, and evidence of unimaginable atrocities. In April 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz and Western allies liberated camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, the full scale of the genocide became undeniable. By the end of the Holocaust, 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe had been murdered. Millions of others were also targeted and killed by the Nazis, including Romani people, disabled individuals, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable. In the post-war years, the Nuremberg Trials brought some of the perpetrators to justice, though many escaped accountability. The Holocaust remains one of the most thoroughly documented genocides in human history and continues to serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of hatred, racism, and silence in the face of injustice. Women in the war effort. During World War II, women around the world stepped into roles that had traditionally been held by men, fundamentally reshaping the workforce, the military, and the perception of gender roles. With millions of men sent to fight on the front lines, countries urgently needed workers to fill the gaps left behind. Women answered the call in massive numbers. In the United States, over 6 million women entered the workforce, many taking jobs in factories, shipyards, and weapons plants. These were often roles that had previously been considered unsuitable for women, involving heavy machinery, technical precision, and physical labor. The image of the woman riveter, famously known as Rosie, became an iconic symbol of this transformation, representing the strength and capability of women contributing directly to the war effort. Women built airplanes, tanks, and weapons, and their efficiency often rivaled or exceeded that of their male predecessors. But it wasn't just in the factories. Women also played crucial roles in agriculture, keeping food production going through programs that trained and organized female labor on farms. They maintained fields, harvested crops, and ensured that civilians and soldiers alike had enough to eat. In the military, women served in specially created branches and even on the front lines in various support roles. In the United States, women took on duties such as clerical work, communications, mechanics, and piloting non-combat aircraft. Female pilots ferried planes from factories to air bases and tested aircraft for safety. In the Soviet Union, women served as snipers, tank drivers, and bomber pilots. Some of the most feared Soviet snipers were women, and entire female air regiments flew dangerous bombing missions under the cover of night, earning nicknames from German forces who feared their precision and bravery. In resistance movements across occupied Europe, women also played a vital role. They smuggled supplies, gathered intelligence, hid fugitives, and risked their lives to deliver messages or sabotage enemy operations. Many were captured, tortured, or killed, but their contributions were critical to the struggle for liberation from Axis control. The impact of women's involvement in the war effort was enormous. It not only contributed directly to the Allied victory, but it also helped shift public attitudes about what women were capable of. Although many were expected to return to traditional domestic roles after the war, the experience had changed both the women and society itself. The legacy of World War II laid the groundwork for future movements toward gender equality. And the women who served, labored, and resisted during those years helped redefine the boundaries of what was possible. Technological advances. World War II was not only a battle between nations and ideologies, it was also a race of innovation. As the world was engulfed in conflict, each side pushed the boundaries of science and engineering, creating new technologies that would shape the future of warfare and human history. One of the most groundbreaking developments was the invention of jet-powered aircraft. Before the war, engineers had imagined planes that could fly without propellers, using jet propulsion instead. During the war, Germany succeeded in bringing this vision to life, with the creation of the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter in history. It could fly faster than any aircraft the Allies had, and it was heavily armed. Although it came too late in the war to change the outcome, its performance marked the beginning of a new era in aviation. At the same time, Britain developed its own jet aircraft, the Gloster Meteor. While it never directly faced the German jet in battle, it proved valuable in shooting down German flying bombs aimed at London. Another leap forward came through the use of rockets. Germany built and launched the world's first long-range guided missile, known as the Vengeance Weapon 2, or V2. This weapon was a terrifying advance. Unlike bombs dropped by planes, the rocket could not be stopped once launched. It flew faster than the speed of sound, struck without warning, and caused destruction in cities such as London and Antwerp. Although it did not alter the outcome of the war, this weapon laid the foundation for the future of space exploration and missile technology, with scientists like Brunner von Braun later playing a key role in the space programs of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Perhaps the most hidden yet powerful technological victory came in the realm of breaking enemy communications. The war was also a battle of intelligence, and controlling information often meant the difference between victory and defeat. In Britain, a group of mathematicians and scientists at a secret facility called Bletchley Park were working to crack Germany's most secure military codes. German messages were encrypted by a complex device called the Enigma machine, which changed its code every day. The team, including figures like Alan Turing, built early computing machines to help break these constantly shifting codes. These machines were able to process intercepted messages at high speed, giving the Allies crucial knowledge about enemy plans, ship movements, and battle strategies. This effort is believed to have shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years. In the Pacific, American codebreakers were also working to uncover the secrets of the Japanese military. They broke the most advanced Japanese diplomatic code, often referred to by historians as the Purple Code. By understanding these encrypted messages, the United States was able to prepare for Japanese movements and gain the upper hand in battles such as the Turning Point fight at Midway Island. From the first jet aircraft to unstoppable rockets to the silent war of decoding secret messages, World War II was more than a clash of weapons. It was a turning point in human technology. These innovations, born out of destruction, would not only help end the war, but would also shape the world that came after. The Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was one of the most secretive and consequential scientific efforts in history. It began in earnest in 1939, when scientists including Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard warned the United States government that Nazi Germany might be attempting to build an atomic bomb. Alarmed by the potential of such a weapon in enemy hands, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized preliminary research, which soon grew into a massive, multi-billion-dollar initiative, spanning multiple cities and involving thousands of people. The project's name, Manhattan Project, was initially just a code reference to its administrative office in Manhattan, but it soon came to encompass an expansive network of laboratories and facilities, including sites in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. The goal was to harness the energy released by splitting the atom, nuclear fission, to create a bomb of unprecedented power. Leading the scientific effort was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist who directed the secret laboratory at Los Alamos. Under his leadership, a diverse team of scientists, many of them refugees from fascist Europe, worked at a feverish pace. Theoretical calculations, engineering breakthroughs, and unprecedented experiments all came together to produce the world's first nuclear weapons. Two types of bombs were developed. One used uranium-235, a rare isotope that required an elaborate enrichment process carried out mainly at Oak Ridge. The other used plutonium-239, produced in nuclear reactors at Hanford. The uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was a simpler design, while the plutonium bomb, called Fat Man, required a complex implosion mechanism. On July 16, 1945, the world changed forever. In the deserts of New Mexico, at a site called Trinity, the first nuclear device was detonated. The explosion lit up the sky with a blinding flash, followed by a thunderous shock wave and a massive mushroom cloud. Scientists watching from a distance were stunned. Oppenheimer famously recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Just weeks later, in early August 1945, the technology was used in war. The United States dropped the Little Boy bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands and leveling the city. 3 days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly afterward, bringing World War II to an end, but ushering in a new era of global anxiety and nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project was a triumph of science and engineering, but it also raised profound ethical questions. Many of the scientists involved later expressed regret or deep ambivalence about their role in creating weapons of mass destruction. The legacy of the Manhattan Project is not just the end of World War II, but the beginning of the nuclear age, a world where humanity gained the power to destroy itself. Propaganda and psychological warfare. Propaganda and psychological warfare were powerful tools used extensively by all major powers during World War II. These tools weren't just about controlling information. They were about shaping minds, demoralizing enemies, and rallying entire populations to support the war effort. Governments realized that battles weren't only fought with bullets and bombs, but also with words, images, and ideas. In Nazi Germany, propaganda was a central pillar of the regime. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a vast campaign to glorify Hitler, demonize Jews, and foster unwavering loyalty to the Reich. Films, posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts painted the image of a strong, righteous Germany surrounded by enemies and traitors. Anti-Semitic propaganda dehumanized Jews and laid the groundwork for widespread public complicity in the Holocaust. Heroic portrayals of German soldiers, along with messages of Aryan superiority, were omnipresent. Even children were targeted with carefully crafted messaging in schools and youth programs. The Allies, too, used propaganda strategically. In the United States, the government created the Office of War Information, which coordinated with filmmakers, writers, and artists to produce content that promoted unity, sacrifice, and support for the troops. Posters encouraged citizens to buy war bonds, conserve resources, and keep quiet about military secrets. Hollywood joined the effort with films glorifying American soldiers and portraying the Axis powers as brutal and inhuman. Cartoons featuring characters like Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck mocked Hitler and Mussolini, using humor to maintain morale and build national solidarity. Britain, facing nightly bombings during the Blitz, used propaganda to boost civilian morale. The famous "Keep Calm and Carry On" poster was part of a broader effort to encourage stoicism and resilience. The BBC played a crucial role by broadcasting reliable news and countering Nazi disinformation, not just to the British public, but also across Europe, offering a voice of hope to occupied nations. Psychological warfare went beyond propaganda. It involved direct attempts to weaken the enemy's morale through deception, intimidation, and confusion. The Allies dropped leaflets over enemy lines, with messages designed to frighten, confuse, or persuade enemy soldiers to surrender. Some leaflets claimed their leaders had abandoned them, or showed photos of prisoners of war being treated well, to encourage desertion. Radio was another battlefield. Nazi Germany broadcast demoralizing messages to Allied troops, using stations like Lord Haw Haw in English, aiming to sap morale by mixing lies with just enough truth to create doubt. In response, the Allies broadcast their own messages into Axis-held territories, promoting resistance and spreading accurate news to counter German lies. Psychological operations also played a role in major military campaigns. Before D-Day, the Allies launched Operation Bodyguard, a massive deception campaign using fake armies, double agents, and misleading communications to convince the Germans that the invasion would happen at Calais instead of Normandy. This psychological manipulation significantly contributed to the success of the invasion. Propaganda and psychological warfare left a lasting legacy. They demonstrated how the human mind could be weaponized and how public perception could become a battlefield, just as critical as land, sea, or air. In World War II, winning hearts and minds was not just a slogan. It was a strategy that helped decide the fate of nations. Life under occupation. When the guns fell silent after battle and invading forces took control, life under occupation began a strange mix of fear, routine, and quiet resistance. In cities across Europe and Asia, ordinary people found themselves caught between survival and defiance. Shops still opened. Children still went to school. Meals were still made. But everything was different. In Nazi-occupied France, citizens faced curfews, food shortages, and constant surveillance. German soldiers patrolled the streets, their presence a daily reminder of the regime now in control. Propaganda posters appeared on walls. Newspapers were censored, and radios were confiscated. Some French citizens collaborated, whether out of ideology or fear of joining the Vichy regime or informing on their neighbors. Others resisted in small, quiet ways by sheltering Jews, passing messages for the resistance, or simply refusing to comply with orders. In Poland, occupation was brutal. The Nazis viewed Poles as racially inferior, and the occupation aimed to destroy the country's culture and intelligentsia. Universities were shut down, books were burned, thousands of teachers, priests, and intellectuals were imprisoned or executed. Meanwhile, daily life was marked by rationing, forced labor, and arbitrary violence. People were deported from their homes, sometimes to make way for ethnic Germans resettled from other parts of Europe. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. In the Netherlands, many tried to carry on as normal for as long as they could. But as restrictions tightened, Jewish citizens were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. The Dutch resistance responded by hiding families in secret annexes, like the one where Anne Frank wrote her diary. Even small acts like refusing to use German currency or distributing banned newspapers became dangerous forms of protest. In the East, under Japanese occupation, life was no less harsh. In places like Nanjing and Manila, civilians endured massacres, sexual violence, and martial law. Puppet governments were installed, and cultural heritage was suppressed. In Korea and China, people were forced to adopt Japanese customs and language. Comfort women. Women and girls forced into sexual slavery suffered one of the most horrific aspects of occupation. But amid the hardship, people adapted. How black markets flourished. Secret schools operated at night. Underground networks moved people, information, and hope. Parents taught their children how to avoid soldiers, how to stay quiet, how to disappear. Songs were sung in whispers. Codes were hidden in laundry lines. Life under occupation was a balancing act between obedience and defiance, between despair and survival. For many, it was a period not just of war, but of silence, a time when the world narrowed to the small, urgent question of how to live under someone else's rule and how to stay human while doing it. War crimes and atrocities beyond the Holocaust. During World War II, atrocities and war crimes extended far beyond the horrors of the Holocaust. In the Asia-Pacific theater, one of the most disturbing examples was Unit 731, a secret biological and chemical warfare research unit operated by the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted gruesome human experimentation on thousands of men, women, and children. Most of them Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Victims were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, infected with deadly pathogens, and exposed to extreme temperatures and conditions to test human endurance. Plague bombs were dropped on Chinese villages to study disease spread, and captives were intentionally mutilated or exposed to weapons to study their effects. Despite these crimes, many of the scientists involved were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their data after the war. Elsewhere, the Japanese military committed widespread atrocities during its invasions. In the rape of Nanking, also known as the Nanjing Massacre, estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were killed in a 6-week rampage by Japanese forces in late 1937. Women were raped on a massive scale, often before being brutally murdered. The atrocities were so extensive and graphic that even some Nazi officials in the city protested them. In Southeast Asia, similar atrocities unfolded. The Japanese occupation of Korea and the Philippines included forced labor, mass killings, and the exploitation of women known as comfort women, a euphemism for those forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. Many were abducted or tricked into servitude and endured years of abuse. On the European front, the Nazis committed countless war crimes beyond the genocide of the Jewish people. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, executed over 1 million people in mass shootings across Eastern Europe, particularly targeting Jews, Roma, communists, and other perceived enemies. In villages like Oradour-sur-Glane in France and Lidice in Czechoslovakia, entire populations were massacred in retaliation for resistance activity. In Lidice, all men were executed, women sent to concentration camps, and children either killed or Germanized. Soviet forces too committed war crimes during and after their advance into Eastern Europe. The mass execution of over 20,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia in the Katyn Forest by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, was a deliberate act to eliminate potential opposition. Or, as the Red Army moved westward, widespread reports emerged of looting, arson, and mass rape, particularly in Germany. In Berlin alone, hundreds of thousands of women were estimated to have been assaulted. Allied forces, though comparatively restrained, were not immune from misconduct. There were instances of summary executions, looting, and mistreatment of prisoners. Bombing campaigns against civilian centers, such as the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, remained controversial, with debates over whether they constituted necessary military action or acts of terror. These atrocities reflect a darker side of the global conflict, showing that the brutality of war was not confined to front lines or battlefields. Civilians often bore the worst of the violence, with lines between soldier and non-combatant erased. The legacy of these crimes still lingers in international law, historical memory, and the call for justice and accountability. The cost of war. World War II was the most devastating conflict in human history, and the cost of the war went far beyond the battlefield. The human toll alone was staggering. It's estimated that between 70 to 85 million people died as a direct or indirect result of the warily 3% of the world's population at the time. Civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. Entire cities were obliterated. Entire communities were wiped out. The Soviet Union lost more than 20 million people, both military and civilian. China lost between 15 to 20 million. Germany, Poland, and Japan each suffered millions of deaths. And the United States lost over 400,000 service members. The Holocaust alone claimed 6 million Jewish lives, and millions more were murdered in other genocides and atrocities committed by the Axis powers. But the cost wasn't only in lives. Cities across Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Entire urban centers were destroyed by bombing raids, artillery, or nuclear fire. Infrastructure, factories, homes, and cultural landmarks were turned to ash. In some places, not a single building stood untouched. The psychological trauma was just as severe. Survivors of bombings, concentration camps, and combat carried lifelong scars, many of which went unspoken and untreated for decades. Economically, the war drained national treasuries. The United States spent over $300 billion on the war effort, equivalent to more than $4 trillion today. Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union all diverted massive portions of their GDP to military production. In post-war Europe, entire economies collapsed. Food shortages and rationing continued for years after the fighting ended. The devastation led to the creation of major global economic institutions, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, in an attempt to stabilize the world order and prevent future disasters of this scale. To rebuild, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, pumping more than $13 billion into Western European recovery. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, with economies restructured to serve the interests of the USSR. In Asia, Japan was occupied and rebuilt under American guidance, rapidly transitioning from a militaristic empire to a pacifist industrial powerhouse. The cost of the war also included a reshaping of the global political and economic map. Old empires collapsed. Colonial possessions gained independence. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. New technologies like nuclear energy and jet propulsion, developed for war, would go on to redefine modern life. But behind every number and statistic lies a human story. Families lost, cities destroyed, and a world forever changed. And that brings us to the end of this journey through World War II, a conflict that reshaped the world in every imaginable way. From the ashes of destruction rose new nations, new alliances, and new hopes. But the lessons of the war remain as relevant today as ever. The importance of standing up to tyranny, the cost of global conflict, and the resilience of the human spirit. These are not just pieces of history, they're warnings and inspirations for the future. If you found this video meaningful, informative, or powerful in any way, consider sharing it so others can reflect on the story of World War II as well. And if you want to see more deep dives into history, philosophy, or thought-provoking topics, hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching and remembering.